Last time we were struggling with the problem of fiction, and I told you that philosophy often works best if you state your problem in the form of a paradox. And the paradox about fiction is that any sentence that can occur in nonfiction can also occur in fiction. There doesn't seem to be any sentences that are exclusive to fiction. There are no sure semantic markers that a work is a work of fiction. And yet, somehow, though the words mean the same, the sentences mean the same in a work of fiction as in nonfiction, all the same, the rules are suspended. You have a different set of conventions applying to fictional discourse. And I made 5 claims about that. I said, in fiction, you don't have real speech acts, you have pretended speech acts. That this is a matter of the speaker's intention. Whether or not something is literature is not up to the author, but whether or not it's fiction is up to the author. It's up to his or her intentions, whether or not it's fictional. That this is made possible by a set of background practices. I describe that as conventions, and I think that's not unfair to describe it as a set of conventions that we have whereby you treat something differently if you know that it's fiction. In that example I gave you from Marguerite Yourcenar, it says on the cover of the book, a novel, and that's not fictional. That statement that it's a novel, that's a straightforward statement of fact about it, so that when you buy it in a bookstore you won't be misled. And consequently, you suspend the normal rules when you're reading it. You take it for granted that the author is not committed to the truth of what she's saying, that she doesn't have to provide evidence, that she doesn't have to believe it, and so on. And then I said there are 2 special cases that raise difficulties for us. One is a first-person discourse, and in that case, the author doesn't just pretend to perform speech acts, but he pretends to be somebody else. Conan Doyle pretends to be John H. Watson, M.D., friend of the famous detective Sherlock Holmes. And a fascinating case is the text of a play. What is the illocutionary force of a text of a play? The author doesn't pretend to tell you what's happening on the stage. Rather, what he does is give a set of instructions to the director and the actors as to how they are supposed to proceed. Typically in that passage I read, it describes the stage setting. And then the actual text of the utterances that the actors are supposed to perform, the utterances they're supposed to make, are a set of instructions to them as to how they are to put on the play. Okay, and I think that's generally right about fiction, but it leaves us with some interesting questions. And one I said was we need to distinguish between a work of fiction and fictional discourse, because not all of the utterances in a work of fiction are intended as fictional. And Tolstoy is an obvious example. In his later years, Tolstoy became obsessed with the fact that he had to achieve some moral aim with his writings. Aesthetic achievement was not enough, and so he's constantly getting across a moral or a message. And sometimes he tells us in straightforward Russian, which is translated into straightforward English, what the point of the story is, the moral of the story. And that, I take it, is not fictional. That is, those are intended as serious speech acts. So that opening sentence in Anna Karenina about happy families and unhappy families, I think, is a straightforward claim on Tolstoy's part, is not intended to be fictional. Now, a more interesting case in War and Peace is the discussion of the Battle of Borodino and Napoleon's campaign in Russia. And there, I think he also had non-fictional aims. I think he was anxious to show us that Napoleon wasn't such a great general as everybody thinks, that in fact these unpretentious Russians, particularly Kutuzov, the head Russian general, even though they're rather simple peasant types and don't have the sophistication of this smarty pants from Paris, all the same, they're better generals. And I think that's an actual claim on his part. I always thought it was ridiculous, but there was a book published in the past year about the Napoleonic campaigns in Russia that suggests that, no, the Russian generals did well, particularly Kutuzov, and he was actually performed better as a general than did Napoleon. However, the point I'm making now, it doesn't depend on the actual facts of Russian history, but on what Tolstoy was trying to do. And it seems to me clear that within the fictional text, within the work of fiction, there are non-fictional utterances. What's the test? How do you tell the difference? Well, ask yourself, what counts as succeeding or failing? What are the conditions of satisfaction? And there it seems to me clear that in Tolstoy's case, he is making actual claims. Okay, so that's another distinction we need, is the distinction between the work of fiction, the whole damn novel, so to speak, and the discourse within it, not all of which is fictional, and the mark is what is claimed by the author, and the test for that is what counts as succeeding or failing. What are the conditions of satisfaction or the conditions of success? Now, often you get different genre of literature marked by the type of commitment that is made. So in a work of science fiction, all kinds of rules are suspended, which would not be suspended in a work of naturalistic fiction. So if Conan Doyle, describing the behavior of Sherlock Holmes and Watson, describes how they got from Baker Street to Paddington Station by going by a route that we know is geographically impossible, they went through Watford or Cambridge or someplace like that, then you'd know he made a mistake, and you'd know there was an error there. On the other hand, there is no claim that there actually was a place such as 221B Baker Street. In fact, there isn't any such place. Literally thousands of American tourists over the years have gone down Baker Street looking for number 221B. There isn't any such a place, and that's not because Conan Doyle made a mistake, but because when he writes Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street, that was a fictional utterance. But now, and this is the last point I want to make about the logical status of fictional discourse, you have to distinguish between the author pretending to perform speech acts and thus creating fictional characters, and us who are the critics or the users of the fictional texts making statements about the characters and the events in the work of fiction. When Conan Doyle says Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street, that's not a statement. That is a pretended statement. It is a fictional utterance. But when I describing the book, I say, yes, Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street, that is a non-fictional statement about a fictional character. So we who are not the authors can use the author's statements to make non-fictional statements about the work of fiction. Same sentence with the same meaning is used to perform two completely different speech acts. Now, Sherlock Holmes is an interesting case because it's something where the author lost control. And in fact, it's now become sort of public property. And Hollywood does all kinds of things with Sherlock Holmes. When I have to dress up for Halloween parties, I usually wear what is mistakenly called a Sherlock Holmes hat. It's in fact a deerstalker hat, but it looks like that. And in fact, there's a certain type of pipe. I don't have one of these, but I suppose I should get one, called a meerschaum pipe. It looks like that. Now, the interesting thing is, there's no, when people see that, people think Sherlock Holmes. I can report this. In fact, when I wear a deerstalker around the neighborhood, a small boy once approached me and said, "Mister, are you a detective?" Because he thought this was what detectives wear. And this is a case where Conan Doyle lost control. I have read the whole damn 9 volumes of Sherlock Holmes because my kids weren't allowed much television. I mean, they could watch serious things like football games, but we didn't allow them to watch ordinary trash. And the result is that I read aloud a whole lot of stuff. I read all 9 volumes of the Sherlock Holmes stories aloud to my children. And I discover there is no deerstalker hat or meerschaum pipe in the Sherlock Holmes stories. So I tracked this down, and this was invented when Sherlock Holmes was put on a play in London, and some director thought it'd be great for him to have this kind of hat and that kind of pipe, and those stuck. So that's a case where Conan Doyle lost control of his own creation. It's interesting if you read aloud to your children. I found that when I took the part of Sherlock, I was unconsciously imitating J.L. Austin. Austin had a Sherlock Holmes style of sensibility, and Sherlock Holmes, it turns out, spoke with precisely that form of precision that Austin both exemplified and insisted upon. In any case, so there are these various other aspects where you can now make true statements. It isn't false to say Sherlock Holmes wore a deerstalker cap, because our conception of the physical character has now gone beyond anything Conan Doyle had in mind. By the way, there's a certain irony here. Arthur Conan Doyle is almost entirely famous today for the Sherlock Holmes stories. But in the end, when he was alive, he came to hate him because he thought he was a great author of English literature. And he wrote all these boring novels that nobody reads. And he got so sick of Sherlock Holmes and Watson that he killed them off. He killed off Sherlock Holmes at the Reichenbach Falls. He had the villain, I've forgotten his name. What? Moriarty. Yes, I see. I mean, I have some educated people here. Moriarty kills off Sherlock Holmes at the Reichenbach Falls. Well, there was such a public outrage, there was such a hue and cry, that he had to bring Sherlock Holmes back to life. Somehow Sherlock Holmes survived the falling and dying at the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland. Anyway, so the point I'm making now is that once the work of fiction is created, we who are not the authors can make true or false statements about Hamlet and Ophelia and Sherlock Holmes and all sorts of other characters. Okay, one last comment about fiction before we go on to the next topic, and that is, why is it such a big deal to us? I mean, all these are pretended stories. There are a number of reasons for that, but one is that the background of a culture is both articulated and in many cases criticized by the works of fiction, the works of literature, the works of fictional literature that are common in that culture. If you want to make a comment about, or if you didn't want to make a comment about racism, you didn't have to write a scholarly article or book. You could write a short story or a novel where you exhibited the phenomena that you were criticizing. And I think one of the interesting things that we derive from reading authors in other traditions is that we imaginatively share the background of that tradition. So here's a philosophical puzzle. I learn a lot from Dostoevsky, let's say, but if I'm asked to state as a set of propositions, well, what exactly did you learn? What precisely did you learn by reading The Devils or Crime and Punishment or The Brothers Karamazov? What propositions did you learn? It would sound pretty lame. I mean, what would I say? Well, you can sure have a hell of a hard time with Russian girls. I mean, think of Natasha. That just seems to miss the point altogether. That's too flat-footed. I think what happens is this, in a case like that, by imaginatively sharing the background of the author and the characters that are being described, you enlarge your own background enormously. You get a deeper sense of your own background and its limitations. There's a peculiar experience that I used to have with Dostoevsky, and that is for the first 50 pages of any of the major novels, you think all these people are absolutely crazy. But after you get about 50 or 100 pages into the book, it seems like the people you see in everyday life are crazy, and the only really sane people are the ones that you're living with while you're reading The Possessed or Crime and Punishment. There you're actually, they acquire a kind of reality, and that's because you come imaginatively to share that background. Now, that's not the whole story. I mean, what is it that when you read some author who shares your background, you don't imaginatively extend your background. When I read Hemingway or, let's say, Salinger, read The Catcher in the Rye, it's a background I'm totally familiar with. All the same, you do deepen your understanding of the background practices and assumptions by reading novelists that are close to home. I mean, for me, Hemingway is like an old shoe. It's perfectly comfortable. He doesn't, at no point do I feel that this is really bizarre or strange as I feel with Dostoevsky or even Svevo. But you do get a deeper understanding. So there's an interesting question, which I think deserves a lot more theoretical attention than has been given, and that is, what exactly do we learn by reading works of literature? And I think it's not a set of factual propositions. It's not that we now know that such and such is the case. Or rather, if you put it as a set of factual propositions, you really miss much of the point. Now, there's another question I don't really know the answer to, and that is, why does the quality of the work make so much difference? There are 4 great novels by Dostoevsky, but he also wrote a lot of junk. And just for curiosity, I sometimes tried to read some of the more boring ones, like Poor Folk and The Gambler and The Friend of the Family. And those leave me unmoved. In fact, I don't know if I finished any of those 3 novels. Now, he wrote them to make money, but he wrote some of the good stuff to make money, too. He was desperate for cash because he had this gambling obsession, and he had all these other problems. But he wrote a lot of trashy novels, and they leave me unmoved. So how is it that I'm better able to share the background with first-rate literature than I am with junk? Yeah, okay. Questions? I'm now going to turn to a completely different topic. I'm now going to turn to Grice and indirect speech acts and conversational implicature and all that kind of stuff. So this is the last that I'll say about fiction. Any questions about what I've been saying? Yeah. Did you have your hand up? Kind of. All right. That's sort of, you're going to ask half a question. Yeah.
Well, maybe you said, what do you learn? Maybe you learn about your reaction. I mean, I had to kind of mention it. I kind of forget what the study is like that. Maybe you
Yeah. See, oddly enough, I don't think the 2 great novels I don't think are as good as the other 2. Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov I don't think are as good as The Idiot and The Possessed. The Possessed is sometimes translated as The Devils, which may be a better translation of the Russian. I think those are actually better than Crime and Punishment or The Brothers Karamazov, though they're all great books. He wrote 4 great novels and then one shorter piece, Notes from Underground, that's also very powerful. But he also wrote a lot of trash. Now, why is it that the great novels have a much better, have much more profound effect on me than the trashy ones, if the ability to get inside the background is probably the same in both cases? I mean, the background of the Poor Folk and The Gambler and Friend of the Family is the same background as Crime and Punishment. By the way, Kotseya has attempted something I would have thought was impossible. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but that's the Nobel Prize-winning guy from South Africa, and it's spelled this way. And is that how it's spelled? Isn't there an E there? Anyway, it's great. I write it on the blackboard. I don't know how to spell it. Anyway, he did something very courageous. He wrote a novel about Dostoevsky. It's called The Master of Petersburg. And I'm about halfway through it. But it is kind of boring because it's, well, roughly speaking, it's too full of ideas to be a really good novel. He wrote another novel that consisted of nothing but ideas called Elizabeth Costello, where Elizabeth, the main character, gives lectures on literature, and that's mostly what you're getting, are a lot of university lectures. So I pronounce it, I'm pretty sure it's C-O-E-T-Z-E. I pronounce it Coetzee, which is quasi-German because it is Dutch. He's from South Africa. It's Afrikaans. But in any case, he did write a novel about a novelist. He wrote a novel about Dostoevsky called The Master of Petersburg. Okay, any other questions? Right, yes?
So when we were talking about Dostoevsky, we talked a bit about maxim.
Yeah.
So when we make true and false statements about fiction, what are we talking about, or what are fiction?
Okay, no, this is a very good question, and I should have answered that already, so let me do it. If I say Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street, that is a true non-fictional statement about a character in fiction. That is a non-fictional statement. That's an actual statement about a fictional character. But if I say, and Mrs. Watson also lived at 221B Baker Street, that suffers from reference failure. That's like the King of France. There was no Mrs. Watson. So if I say, Mrs. Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street. In fact, Watson did get married, but Conan Doyle didn't know what to do with Mrs. Watson, so he killed her off. So Mrs. Watson died, poor thing. But if I say Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street and Mrs. Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street, that seems to me like the King of France. There was no. And the same analysis would go into play. There was no Mrs. Sherlock Holmes because Holmes never got married. Anyway, it's a good point that there can be reference failure if I'm misinformed about a work of fiction. And I think there was a Mrs. Sherlock Holmes. And I say Mrs. Sherlock Holmes was bald. That's exactly like the King of France was bald because there wasn't any Mrs. Sherlock Holmes. Okay, other questions? I mean, these are interesting puzzles, and it's a good idea to test your theory of language on cases that philosophers don't mostly worry about, like fictional utterances. And I think the theory that I'm giving you can deal with them by assimilating them to a special type of use of language, but not another kind of speech act. Various literary critics have said, well, fiction is just another kind of speech act, along with assertives, directives, commissives, expressives, and declarations. There's a sixth kind, fiction. No, that's not right. Fiction is not a separate type of speech act on all fours with the others. Rather, it is a deliberate suspension of the rules of speech act. It's as if somebody said, well, in addition to American dollars and Canadian dollars and European yen and Chinese renminbi, there's also monopoly money. You don't want to leave out monopoly money. No, monopoly money is not a type of money along with all of the others. It is is pretended money, and in that sense, works of fiction are pretended. Now, whenever I've said this to authors, to audiences of professors of English and so on, they usually get furious because they think I'm trying to put down literature by saying it's not serious or something like that. But of course, that's not the case at all. What I'm trying to do is analyze its logical status, and that's not a term that figures largely in literary courses. So they're not sure what logical status is. But the logical status means its status in logic, where logic is a matter of meaning, truth, entailment, necessity, and all the rest of it. And what I want to know is how do those categories apply to fictional discourse, given that those in general are functions of meaning, and the meanings of the words is the same. So we have to be able to answer the question, how is it that those considerations are suspended if the meanings of the words are exactly the same, and the speaker means the same thing by them. Now, it's often puzzled me, are there any syntactical forms that you can only find in fiction? And I think no. It's tempting to think, well, how about once upon a time? Isn't that an illocutionary force indicator that indicates that what follows is fictional? I don't think so. Once upon a time, there's a kind of extra-linguistic convention where that has evolved as a signal, a sort of almost a childlike signal that what follows is supposed to be fictional. But in fact, there are ironic uses of that. If I write a newspaper story by saying, once upon a time, There was a little boy named Billy Clinton, and he grew up to, and so on and so on. Then I go on. Then it's straightforward nonfiction. I write, ironically, about William Jefferson Clinton. So I don't think that is that the meaning of that is such that to determine that what follows is fictional, though there is an extra semantic convention that we only use it in those cases. And by the way, it translates into other language. In German, it's es war einmal, which is basically once upon a time. It was once the case that. And in French, il y avait une fois. And in Spanish, what? That must be some past tense of haber plus una vez or something like that. I don't know Spanish well enough, but those of you who do can fill me in on that. But in any case, other European languages that I know also have translations of once upon a time. They have equivalents of that as a conventional but non-semantic marker of the beginning of a fictional story. And there is in English a tense, well, it's not even a tense so much, but it's a syntactical style. Style indirect libre is the French for it. Indirect freestyle, which is typically used only for fictional discourse, where you try to get inside the mind of the character. But that's for epistemic reasons, that we don't normally have this, the omniscient narrator's epistemic position where we can know what all of our characters are thinking, what all of our friends are thinking, whereas the author can know if he wants to. He can know what his characters are thinking because he invents them. They're his creations. Yes? Yeah. There is in French a tense that is typically only used in very formal circumstances, normally only in formal text. And my French is almost entirely spoken French, so I never use that. And I'll have to look it up. Yeah, but I'll check it out. There are certain tenses in French. I speak a lot of French. I spend a month a year in Paris, and I talk French all the time. But there are certain tenses. I mean, for example, the subjunctif imparfait. When did you last use the imperfect subjunctive? God knows. I have enough trouble with the subjunctive. But in any case, let me check that out. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. What is it? The passé simple. Oh, yeah, the passé simple. Yeah, il fut. Yeah, I never say il fut. Yeah, it's he was in the passé simple. Okay, I never use the passé simple, but I'm sure many of you do. Okay, let's go on then to the next topic, which is going to be Grice's theory of conversation. And that, I think, was an important addition to the theory of speech acts, but I need to make certain criticisms of it. I think it's not, I mean, it's inconsistent with the account that I've been giving in certain crucial respects. And then we'll use that to go on to discuss indirect speech acts. Okay, Grice says that there are certain maxims of human communication or human conversation. And that in general, these maxims follow from the nature of rationality itself. Rationality determines that there are certain constraints on conversation and that these lead to more efficient that following these constraints leads to much more efficient human communication, and that when these constraints are violated in certain ways, then you get certain types of conversational implications, or, as he calls them, conversational implicatures. Now, and typically, these constraints are not encoded in literal meaning. Sometimes they are, and a good example he gives is the difference between and but. The truth conditions of P and Q are the same as P but Q. But you wouldn't normally say P but Q unless there was some kind of a contrast. If you say he was poor but he was honest, you are implying that there's some sort of contrast between being poor and honest. If you say she's very intelligent but still good looking, that implies that there's some kind of contrast between for a woman between being intelligent and being good-looking. But you haven't actually stated that. But that is carried by the conversational implicature. But this is a case where the implicature is encoded in meaning, where there is an implied contrast. But it's not easy to state exactly what the meaning of but is. And similarly, in other languages, there's a lot of literature about the German doch. And I don't know, I don't have a theory about doch. My German isn't good enough, but it's like it has the same sort of difficulty as with but. What exactly are the constraints on the kind of contrast implied by P but Q? But the more interesting cases are cases where the implicature is not encoded in the literal meaning. If I say they got married and had a baby, that sounds different from they had a baby and got married. And some people at some point said, well, that shows that the and in logic doesn't mean the same as the and in ordinary language. But Grice, I think, proved conclusively it doesn't show that at all. It's just an extra constraint on conversation, not part of the literal meaning. If you say they got married and had a baby, as opposed to they had a baby and got married, you imply, but it's not strictly speaking semantically entailed, you imply that that's the order in which the events occurred, that first they got married and then later they had a baby. Now there's a good test that Grice gives us, and that is, can you cancel the implication? And you can in the case of the example I just gave you. If I say, I had a baby and got married, I can say, but I don't mean to imply that they had the baby first. And that's perfectly all right. I can cancel the implication. I can cancel the implicature. Whereas with normal entailment relations, you can't cancel the implication. You can't say, well, it was a triangle, but I don't mean to say that it was a three-sided plane figure. No, if it's a triangle, that entails that it was a three-sided plane figure. Okay, now I think these are important points, and Grice tried to generalize them with a series of maxims. Partly ironically, he uses Kant's distinction of quantity, quality, manner, and relation for naming his maxim. So the maxim of quantity is, or the maxim of quantity have to do with how much you say when you're saying something. And the maxims are, don't say too much, but don't say too little. Try to say just enough. So if you say, where is Sam? And I say, Sam's in the kitchen, well, that sounds pretty, that's a pretty much right for normal conversation. I assume you're looking for Sam. But it would be absurd of me to say, Sam is exactly 37 centimeters north-northwest of the refrigerator and 57 centimeters south-southeast of the kitchen sink. That's too much information. I don't need that kind of information if I want to know where Sam is. On the other hand, if you ask me, where is Sam? And I say, Sam is currently in the northern hemisphere. Well, that's not cooperating, because yeah, of course he's in the northern hemisphere. You want to know where the hell is he in the northern hemisphere? And it's possible to lie. Well, I have to modify that. It's possible to mislead people without actually lying. There's a famous biblical story about one of the characters is being chased by Roman troops. I forget which one of the saints it was. We'll call him Sam, just to have a name. And the Roman troops approach Sam, and they say, where's Sam? And he looks at these Roman troops and says, he's not far from here. Maybe even pointing ahead. Now, it's true he's not far from here. Sam, being a good Christian, couldn't actually lie, but he did mislead them, because when he says he's not far from here, he appears to be following the maxim of quantity, giving them as much information as is necessary for the purposes of the conversation, but he is not, in fact. The reason Sam is not far from here is that he's exactly here. I am Sam, but he doesn't say that. So this is a case where you flout the maxim of quantity. The maxim of quantity says, I say enough for the purpose of the conversation. Don't say too much, and don't say too little. Now, the maxim of quality is where he gets closer to the theory of speech acts, and he says the maxim of quality really has three parts. Only say what is true, only say what you believe to be true, and only say what you have good evidence for the truth of. Now, I think, in fact, these are encoded as part of the essence of making a statement. They're not like the other maxims, which are, so to speak, additions to the theory of speech acts, that you ought to perform a speech act which gives the right amount of information, not too much and not too little. But these, he's actually giving us the essential condition. Now, this is me, not him. The essential condition, the sincerity condition, and the preparatory condition about evidence. And I think this is my main disagreement with Grice. I don't think this stuff is on all fours with things like don't say too much and don't say too little. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But his sub-maxims of the maxim of quality are don't say, only speak the truth, but that, I want to say, is not an extra maxim built on top of assertions. That's the definition of an assertion. The definition of an assertion is it is a commitment to truth, and for that reason you're committed to sincerity, and also you're committed to providing evidence. Grice treats them, Grice, and it's common among philosophers to do this, treats assertion as one thing, and then, oh, by the way, we have a rule about assertions: only say true ones, only say ones you believe, and only say ones for which you have evidence. And I want to say, you can't say what an assertion is without saying that it's a commitment to truth, and therefore a commitment to sincerity, and where rational, a commitment to being able to answer such questions as how do you know? What sort of evidence do you have? So that's my main disagreement with Grice, is that I don't think all the maxims are on all fours. They play a different role. This one plays a different role in language. But let me go to the others. Somebody had a hand up over here. Both, two guys. You first, you, then you. Yeah. Yeah. What I wrote was that is a preparatory condition. It's not a fourth category. This stuff that I'm giving you here, truth, belief, these are Grice, and this is Searle. I'm telling you, this is I'm sorry, it looks like a gerrymandered constituency, but in any case, Grice is telling us you have to have truth, belief, and evidence, and I'm saying that's already part of the theory of speech acts. You have to have the essential condition, which is a commitment to truth. You have to have the sincerity condition, and you have to have the preparatory condition about evidence. I think my account is better because you get a more general account of speech acts, since these categories apply to all kinds of speech acts: the essential condition, the sincerity condition, and the preparatory conditions. But I'm now, for the next few minutes at least, just telling you Grice's views. And the maxims are quantity, quality, and there's another person had a hand up. Yeah. He thinks it's part of our rational conception of conversation that it should. But since it normally does, when we're normally, it's like saying, are the rules of football normative or descriptive? Well, if you don't follow enough of them, you're not playing football. On the other hand, they do set normative standards. So he thinks of these as normative. However, they are frequently violated, and indeed much of his work on this is about what happens when they are violated. And there are deliberate violations where you get an implicature, what I would call an indirect speech act. And I'm going to use these to some extent to give you a theory of indirect speech acts. So when you say, "Sir, you're standing on my foot," Grice says that follows the maximum of relevance. Why is he saying that? What's the relevance of that to the present situation? And the answer is he wants you to get off of his foot if he says that. So in addition to quantity and quality, we get manner and relation. And the manner, the maxim of manner breaks down into a bunch of sub-maxims, and there are such things as be clear, don't be obscure, don't be ambiguous, don't be too prolix, and don't be disorderly. Ambiguity or disambiguity, that is univocality. So don't be ambiguous, don't be too wordy, be brief, be orderly, and avoid obscurity are the four maxims of manner. And I think those are frequently violated. In fact, there are certain schools of philosophy, not ones that I'm sympathetic with, where they're more or less systematically violated. I don't know if I've told you this story, but I once had a conversation with a famous French philosopher who's a friend of mine, and I said to him, "Why the hell do you write so badly? Pourquoi tu écris si mal?" And he said, "Look, if I wrote as clearly as you do, people in Paris wouldn't take me seriously. You know, they'd think it's childlike, it's naive." This was Michel Foucault, and he was a very smart guy and wrote a lot of very good stuff. But in general, he just wrote badly. When you heard him give a lecture in Berkeley, it was perfectly clear, just as clear as I am. So why don't you write clearly? And he said, "Well, in France, it would not be. It would be regarded as somewhat childish and naive if you wrote clearly." And I said, "Come on, no, tu te moques un peu de moi, you're making fun of me. Tell me exactly why you write so badly, because in conversation you're just as clear as I am." And he said, "En France, il faut avoir au moins 10% incompréhensible." And that translates as, in France, you got to have 10% incomprehensible. Otherwise, people won't think it's deep. They won't think you're a profound thinker. And I gave a series of lectures in Paris at the Collège de France with another very famous French philosopher as my host, Pierre Bourdieu. And I told this story to Pierre, you know, what did he think of that? And he said, "It's worse than 10%, more like 20%. And I have to say, if you read Bourdieu, yeah, 20% at least is. I once assigned one of, I had admired Bourdieu, I thought he was a terrific guy, and the conversation just as clear as you or me. But I once assigned one of his books for a course I was teaching in Berkeley, The Logic of Practice, and my students couldn't make head nor tail out of it. And the truth to tell, I have trouble trying to figure out what he's saying. So you can have a look at that. It's called The Logic of Practice is the English translation. And it's about the background. It's about what I call the background, and I thought they ought to have somebody else's conception of the background. So Bourdieu and Foucault wrote a kind of Franco-German. It was very obscure. Now, Foucault got more clear later on in life, and in fact, he told a friend of mine that he preferred life in America because he could write more clearly, but his English wasn't very good, so he didn't. He told, what's that guy's name? Yves Michaud. He told Yves, he said, if I spoke better English, I'd move permanently to the United States. But his English was not all that great. But in any case, there are cases where the maxim of clarity, don't be obscure and don't be ambiguous, those are systematically violated, and I think German philosophy has a lot to answer for. See, there was a time when I learned French when the slogan was "Ce qui n'est pas clair n'est pas français." If it's not clear, it's not French. That has been abandoned in French philosophy, and a lot of it is very obscure. Okay, now relation is the one that's most interesting for our present purposes. And Grice says there's only one maxim of relation, and that is be relevant. So generally, in a conversation, you will assume that utterances people make are intended to be relevant. And consequently, you get a lot of ways of interpreting utterances that depend on the assumption that the utterance is relevant. When I gave you that example a few minutes ago of the guy who says, you're standing on my foot, you wonder, why is that relevant? It's not like saying, if he says to you out of the blue, the Earth is 93 million miles from the sun, well, what's that relevant to? You have no idea. But you know, when he tells you you're standing on my foot, he's got something in mind. He wants you to get off his foot, and that is a case where you apply the maxim of relevance to get a conversational implicature that what is implied is a directive, though what is actually stated, what is literally stated, is an assertive. He makes a flat statement about where you're standing. Okay, now I want you to keep that in mind, because I'm now going to go to our next main subject, and that is indirect speech acts. But any questions about Grice? I have made one. I agree with Grice except on one crucial point, and that is I think that these are not on all fours, that the quality is built into the nature of the speech act, that the assertion is essentially a commitment to truth, and that is why I call it the essential condition. And then the sincerity condition and the preparatory conditions follow from that, that you are expressing a belief when you make an assertion, and you are committing yourself to being able to answer such questions as, how do you know? What's the evidence? So I don't think that the maxims are on all fours. I think that the maxim of quality are built into the structure of assertion, and that's why I think it's misleading to characterize all three of these sets as just maxims. They're just sort of rules of thumb, guides to good behavior. The case of the commitment to truth, that's built into the structure of the speech act. Okay, questions or comments about Grice? I now want to turn to indirect speech acts. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, okay, I think the short answer is there are different kinds of humor. Now, all humor relies on the element of surprise. And this is why, the same joke repeated over and over ceases, even the best joke ceases to be funny. But some jokes rely on violating these maxims. They rely on saying things that are supposed to be relevant but aren't. But anyway, why don't you come back with some jokes, and we'll see and analyze how they work. It takes the fun out of the joke to analyze how it works, but I think it's a good intellectual exercise. But there is always an element of surprise. Woody Allen is a source, and the Marx Brothers are a source of logical jokes. But the case of the joke is different. The logical structure of the joke is not always the same. It always relies on an element of surprise. So when Groucho Marx, the guy collapses, and the Groucho Marx grabs his wrist to feel his pulse, looks at his watch, and says, either this guy's dead or my watch has stopped. Now, it's not his best joke. But if you analyze it, there's an element of surprise there, because you don't think of those as alternatives when you're taking the pulse. I mean, those are not the two options. Either the guy's dead or my watch has stopped. He should be able to tell if his watch has stopped and if his watch is, well, I mean, I won't go through the, I won't go through all the permutations. But take jokes like that and analyze how they actually work, and I think you'll see some of them do violate Grice's maxims. But it wasn't Grice's maxims. It wasn't the purpose of the maxims to explain jokes. I mean, it's a good test case for anybody's theory of language. How do you deal with jokes? And the answer is that they're not all the same, but they do all rest on an element of surprise. Some expectation is violated by the joke. But Grice did think that he could explain a lot of features of conversation, and in particular, he wanted to be able to explain the apparent lack of match between the logical properties of language as described in mathematical logic, the logical properties of words like if and or and not, and how they function in actual conversation. And his general theme was that the meaning of and is the same in logic as it is in conversation. It's just in conversation we have extra constraints that go beyond the meaning of and these are conversational maxims. So the conversational maxim will tell you that if somebody says P and Q, you can assume P occurred first and then Q. They got married and had a baby will be different from they had a baby and got married, not because there's difference in meaning, but because it's the conversational requirements of clear communication. There is a sort of assumption that the order in which a series of events are narrated is the same order as the order in which it occurred. But you can demonstrate that that's not an actual semantic property of the meanings of the sentences uttered, because you can cancel that implication. You can say P and Q, but I don't mean to imply that P occurred first and then Q occurred later. You can cancel it. Whereas with straight logical implication, you can't cancel it. You can't say it's a three-sided plane. It's a triangle, but I don't mean to imply that it's a three-sided plane figure. I mean, that is straight contradiction, because that's what triangle means. Okay, any other questions about Grice? But try it out. I mean, take a half a dozen jokes and analyze how they work. And I think you'll find Marx Brothers rely heavily on logical properties. Woody Allen less so. Woody Allen relies on elements of surprise. When Woody Allen says, the brain is my second favorite organ, we're surprised by that, because we automatically know what his first favorite organ is, and we don't think of, well, I won't go through the steps of the argument. You can work it out for yourself. But the element of surprise there is like the element of surprise in the Marx Brothers example. Okay, other questions about Grice? I mean, there's a lot to be said about Grice, and there's a huge literature about Grice. And indeed, there's an entire book just about this one, just called Relevance. And the book is by Sperber and Wilson. And I never finished it. I got bored with the examples, but that's a fault of me and not a fault of them. I'm sure it's a fine book all the way along. It's just I never made it all the way to the end. Sperber and Wilson. Oh, by the way, I have to go to Madrid next week. I'll be lecture on Tuesday, but the following Tuesday I won't. I'll be lecturing in Madrid. The reason they'll both be at that conference. So if you get any questions about their book, I can ask them. But I'll announce that on next Tuesday what our plans are going to be. Now, I had thought we were lecturing Thursday, but it turns out that's a holiday. So you're going to miss I don't know how you're going to survive missing 2 straight lectures. But anyway, Thursday and Tuesday I'll be. Thursday will be a holiday, and on a week from next Tuesday I'll be in Madrid. Okay, let's go on now to indirect speech acts. Now here's a phenomenon that interests me. There are lots of uses of sentences in conversations where the speaker means something more than what the sentence means. The speaker does mean what the sentence means, but he means something more than that. And in this respect, indirect speech acts differ, for example, from metaphors, where the speaker doesn't mean literally what he says. If I say Hegel is a dead horse on the European philosophical market, it won't do for you to say, well, what color horse was he? You know, because I didn't mean it literally. But if I say, sir, you're standing on my foot, as an indirect request for you to get off my foot, then I do mean that literally. It's just I mean more than what I actually said. Now, what's the proof that I did mean it literally? And the proof is that the response to the literal utterance is always appropriate. I might, for example, say, no, I'm not standing on your foot. It's the guy next to me who's standing on your foot. I'm not standing on your foot at all. It's just that guy put his foot across my foot in order to be able to stand on your foot. It's kind of awkward to imagine it, but I guess you can. We're in a big crowd, we'll suppose. Okay, so in an indirect speech act, the literal meaning is always intended, but something more is intended. Now, why do we do this? Why do we speak indirectly? Well, often it's just more efficient. You can answer the question by sidestepping a lot of steps. If you say, did the Americans win the Battle of Midway? You ask me. And instead of saying yes or no, I say they sank the 4 biggest Japanese aircraft carriers. Now that answers the question, but it answers it indirectly because it was a yes-no question, and I answered it by making a statement. That is one source of indirect speech acts, is a kind of efficiency where you sidestep several steps. However, I think the most common source of indirect speech acts where directives are concerned is politeness. It's just more polite if you want to ask somebody to do something. Instead of saying do it, which is rather rude, if you say, can you do it, would you do it, will you do it, would you like to do it, I want you to do it, and so on. And if you look at these, it's they're quite systematic. It's not an accident that you get certain kinds of utterances and not others. And I've classified those. Now we're talking about ways. The question we're asking now is, how many ways are there of asking somebody to do something without actually saying do it, without actually using the imperative mood? And I think there are a whole bunch of ways. Is this thing working? Are you getting? Okay. There are a whole bunch of ways to do it, and they're systematic. One is there are statements and questions about H's ability to do the thing. And those occur both in the assertive and in the interrogative. So the interrogative is more common, and you get things like, can you, and could you, and are you able, and would you be able. You can go through a whole lot of these and try them out. So think of the ways at a dinner table you can ask somebody to pass the salt without saying pass the salt. You can say, can you reach the salt? Can you pass the salt? Could you pass the salt? All of those are perfectly legitimate and common forms of indirect speech acts requesting somebody to pass the salt. Now, you also get the assertive forms with H's ability, such as, well, you could make a little less noise, or you can go now, where you tell somebody that they can or could do something by way of asking them to do it. That's much less polite than the can you, could you, are you able, would you be able. Much less polite to just make the flat assertion. Why? Well, the question form appears to give the hearer a choice how to answer it. Can you reach the salt? The hearer might say, no, I can't. It's too far away. And even when you don't give him a choice, it's more polite to at least appear to give the hearer a choice. So the question is almost invariably more polite than the flat assertion. You can make a little less noise. Now, when do we use are you able as opposed to can you? I think we'd only use it if it's a big deal in the indirect form. If I say, can you reach that book over there, that is the standard. But if I say, are you able to reach that book over there, that suggests some difficulty. I might say, are you able to reach the book on the top shelf if it's high up? But if somebody says to me, when the book is this far away, are you able to reach that book, they would be implying that there's some kind of difficulty. So it's a peculiarity of English that we have these phrasal equivalents, and that's due to an oddity of English that we do not allow one modal operator, one modal auxiliary verb to follow another in the same sentence. So we have I might be able to do this for you, but you don't have I might could do this for you. Now there are dialects, there are hillbilly dialects, I love them, where you still people say I might could do this for you. And that really does go back a long time. It'd be interesting to track that down. But in general, you cannot have two modal auxiliary verbs, might and can, one on top of another. I might can do that. No. You have to have I might be able to do that. German still allows the iterated modal auxiliaries. You can stack one top of another. Das hätten Sie sehen sollen. You get these. I mean, German loves to stack verbs on top of another, but not in English. You cannot do it with modal auxiliaries, and we have these phrasal equivalents, as they're called. So for can, you get are you able, and that partly it becomes a bigger deal to ask the person, are you able? But also you have to use it when you've got one of these stacked on top another. We don't get would you could do it, would you can do it. We have to have would you be able to do it. Yeah. Yeah. I wish I knew. Chomsky, I once asked him what his theory of the modal auxiliaries was, and he says, I try not to think about them because they're too hard. And my general experience has been that people who think really hard about may and might and can and could and would and should and ought and all that, in the end they go crazy. I could maybe do it for you. Yeah, that sounds a bit colloquial to me, but I could maybe do it for you. Maybe I could do it for you sounds better. But I don't know why. If you ask me why, it sounds better. And there are these oddities in English, and I may have mentioned these to you before. You have, it's very rare in English that you get two words that are pretty much synonymous, but ought and should are synonymous, though if you track down the etymology, it's totally different. This is the past tense of the Old English verb meaning to owe. So you, in the Middle Ages, you would say, I ought thee 30 ducats, but I paid thee last Michaelmas. That means I owed you. But should goes back to a root that predates the German even, and it's obviously related to the German sollen, which pretty much has usage that are equivalent to the English should and shall. Okay, so you do have these modal verbs that are used here, and they're going to figure in other forms of common indirect speech acts. But the first set is about the hearer's ability, and the generalization we can make is that you can perform an indirect speech act of asking somebody to do something, either by asking them whether they are able, that's the polite way, or are telling them that they are able, that's the less polite way. Now there's a second class, and that is with the speaker's desire or wish that the hearer would do it. And here you only get the assertive, you don't get the question form where, you get things like, I want you to do this for me, I'd like you to do it, I sure would appreciate it if you did it, I hope you'll do it. All of those are cases where you express a desire that the hearer do something and thus ask the hearer to do it. But it sounds odd to say, do I want you to do this, or do I desire you to do that? And I think that's essentially for epistemic reasons. I'm the best person. I'm in the best situation to say what my desires are. So it sounds odd for me to ask somebody else what my desires are. That's essentially for Cartesian reasons. That is, I'm in the best position to say what my desires are. So typically, in common discourse, you can ask somebody to do something by saying, I'd like you to do it, I want you to do it, I'd rather you did it, I hope you'll do it. All of those are expressions, but you don't get, do I want you to do it, would I like you to do it? I mean, maybe that would be a case where you'd ask your psychoanalyst, do I want you to do it, or do I, would I like you to do it? But in normal, ordinary conversation, I think there's a contrast in that H's ability can be either queried or asserted, but S's desire can only be asserted and not queried. Now there's a third group, and that it has to do with S's actually doing the act. S's actually performing the act. And there, it seems to me, you get the same pattern that you had with the ability. You get the question mark is more polite, but you also get the assertion as an indirect order. Undergraduates will hand in their term papers on time this semester. That's a directive and not a prediction. But if often you will perform an indirect speech act by asking the person if they will do it. Will you do this for me? Are you going to do this? Can be an indirect directive. And once again, I think the assertive is just a lot less polite because it gives the hearer no choice. Will you pass the wine is much more polite than you will now pass the wine. That's sort of has a flavor of or else along with it, and precisely for this reason that the assertive form does not allow an option. Now, there is another class that's quite interesting, and those have to do with the hearer's desire to do it. Do you want to do this? Do you want to pass the salt? Do you want to help me out with this problem? Do you want to clean up your room? All of these are cases where you ask somebody to do something by asking them if they have a desire or want to do it. And there again, we get the question mark. But in this case, you get the opposite of the speaker's desire. You don't get the assertion. You want to do this, but you do get the query, do you want to do this? And that, I think, again, is for conversational, for Cartesian reasons. I'm not in a position to tell you what your desires are, but I am in a position to ask you about your desires. Do you want to do this? Can be a way of asking you to do it. But you want to do this sounds presumptuous because I'm not in a position to tell you what your desires are. Now again, there are odd, interesting exceptions. I once picked up a teenager who was hitchhiking, and she was a gold mine of English odd usages. And at one point she said to me, we were getting into Berkeley, and said, she said, you want to hang a left at the next turn. And I almost stopped the car. Wait a second, have you not read Descartes? How do you know what my desires are? You want to hang a left at the next turn? Well, I think she was not attempting to describe my desires, but I got so interested in the case, I looked it up. And it turns out that want comes from an old Norwegian verb, which I will not attempt to pronounce, V-A-N-R. God knows how you would pronounce that. But it means need. It doesn't mean desire. It means need. And what she was telling me, she wasn't Norwegian as far as I know, but what she was telling me is you need to hang a left. Or if you're taking me home, you have to hang a left at the next turn. Not that you've suddenly been stricken with a desire to turn left at the next corner. So does everybody see this point? The point is that in the case of asking somebody to do something, by asking them if they want to do it, it's okay to ask them to do it by asking if they want, but not in general okay to tell them what they want. Not okay to tell them that they want to do it, because you're seldom in a position to know what they want. Her apparent counterexample of that, I think, is not a counterexample because she meant need. And indeed, when the mechanic says to me, well, your car wants a new carburetor, he's not saying the car has been afflicted with this yen or lust for a new carburetor, but he's saying it needs a new carburetor. Yeah?
Okay, so, but if you guys had agreed on the fact that you were taking her home, that would be like an established desire to have.
Yeah, then this would be a derived desire.
I mean, I think that that's a pretty common thing to say. You're going to want to do X if this is your end goal.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Well, that isn't how it proceeded. We got into Berkeley, and I said, where do you want me to drop you off? And she said, you want to hang a left at the next turn. That was that kind of thing. Though there might be, even that's a bit odd, though, because how would she know what my desires are? I mean, it might be rational me to have that desire. What I think is she didn't mean desire. She didn't mean you desire to hang a left, but rather you need to hang a left given that you're going to drop me off at my house. Okay, now then you get this large class of reasons for action. And that is where ought and should come in. Reasons for action, and ought and should are ways of expressing reasons, and you get some peculiar variations on the affirmative and on the assertive and the interrogative and the question. If I say you ought to drink less alcohol, that can be an order to you. That can be an indirect request to drink less alcohol by way of saying that there are reasons for you to drink less alcohol. But if the wife says to her husband at the party, should you really drink another martini, that is a very peculiar form of indirect request, but because it works as follows. I'm asking you, is there good reason for you to drink a martini? And the assumption behind the question is that in the absence of a good reason to drink a martini, you have a reason not to drink a martini. That is a negative request. You ought to drink another martini is a request to do it. But the interrogative, ought you to drink, is a request not to do it on the assumption that the absence of a reason to do it is itself, in this case, a reason for not doing it. So you get all these cases of the case, ought you, you ought, and also the why questions. Why are you doing that can be a request to stop doing it. Why are you making so much noise when I'm trying to finish my term paper can be a request to stop making so much noise, again on the same assumption, that unless there are good reasons for you to make so much noise, then you have a reason for not making so much noise. If we're driving along the road and I say we ought to have lunch, and you say, well, why not stop here? There's a good restaurant here. The why not form there is a request to stop, and it works by asking you to provide a reason on the assumption that your failure to provide a reason for stopping here will itself give us a reason for stopping here, or make some other reason that we have operative, so that we, again, ought expresses reasons that we ought to stop here. Okay, just to summarize this then, ought and should are used to express reasons for action. You tell somebody that they ought to do something, you're telling them that there are good or overriding reasons for doing it. Similarly with should. But the interrogative is different because the interrogative is a challenge to provide a reason on the assumption that the failure to provide a reason will be a reason for not doing the thing for which the reason was a challenge. So if I say, ought you to drink another martini, or should you really drink another martini, then that is a request not to drink the martini on the assumption that unless you can give me a good reason, you really have a reason to stop drinking, and therefore the utterance will be interpreted as a request to stop. Okay, now there's a last class that I want to mention, and that is where you get embeddings, where you embed one of these. This is 5. There's a 6th class where you embed one inside another. And those are things where people say things to me like, look, would you mind awfully if I asked you if you could possibly write me a letter of recommendation? I want to go to law school, and I would sure appreciate it if you could possibly, and then you see how they're embedding one of these inside another, so you get these complex embeddings. Okay, now I think if we combine Grice's maxim of relation, namely that you assume that all of this is relevant, if you combine that with a theory of speech acts, then you get a very simple explanation of why these fall out in the way they do, and it applies to other types of speech acts. And I'll go on with that next time.